Welcome to this episode of CEO Perspectives, a signature webcast and podcast series by the Conference Board. CEO Perspectives take an in-depth look at insights on the issues of our time, the things that matter most to our business leaders. We'll sit down with thought leaders and experts on a variety of topics and do what we do best at the Conference Board, provide trusted insights for what's ahead. I'm Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board and the host of this series. And in today's conversation, we're going to talk about sustainability in times of stress, like the times we've been in the last couple of years. What is the status of sustainability? What should companies be thinking about? Where are we going with it? Joining me today is Paul Washington, a leading voice in sustainability and corporate citizenship matters. He is the executive director and leader of the Center for ESG at the Conference Board. Paul, welcome.
Thank you. Delighted to be with you, Steve.
So we have to sort of go pre-COVID and then post-COVID. So let's just describe the environment and the focus of sustainability before COVID.
Sure. You know, sustainability started as an idea in the corporate world, decades ago. And I would say it had pretty much a green tinge. It was largely focused on environmental issues. But in the last decade, I think we've seen three broad trends. The first is a broadening of the definition of sustainability. It's no longer just focused on environmental issues. It includes social issues as well. And it's really focused on the long-term sustainability of the company, society at large, and the natural environment. So sustainability is a broader concept than in the past. Second broad trend is it's moved beyond compliance. Okay, you've got to do what the law requires. And it's moved even beyond sort of risk mitigation. And it now includes more focus on cost reduction and even revenue opportunities. And I think this is where US companies in particular may have an advantage over some of their European competitors in seizing some of those opportunities. And then I think the third thing is sustainability has gone from something that was siloed within companies to becoming increasingly integrated into the company's business strategy. So those are three broad trends of what's happening.
Yeah, and it sort of started out as the do-gooders, and companies were getting criticized for their environmental records and all that. So what do we do? All right, well, let's get a do-gooder and we'll bring them in. Yeah. And it was a cost because it's going to that world, I mean, that's just like ancient history.
It certainly is. And look, there's been a change in the dynamic too between companies, nonprofits, the new do-gooder nonprofits, and regulation. Companies are now actually leading in this area. And rather than being prodded by the nonprofits, they're often partnering with them. The other thing that's happened is that regulation is no longer leading the way, it's actually lagging companies here. And that creates a risk that as companies are looking at sustainability as a business strategy matter, they can get dragged back into thinking about sustainability as a compliance matter. And that's not good. I'll give you a very practical example. I was talking to the general counsel of a leading company, and she said, you know what? Because of the new SEC disclosure rules, I have to take a lawyer who's going to help us work on sustainability growth opportunities, and they're spending all their time now working on complying with the SEC disclosure rules.
It is interesting to look back. Because, when you look forward, you go, oh, we're trying to get to a zero carbon world. We've got so far to go, But, just in our careers, we've come a long way. Remember when the Cuyahoga River caught fire? A river catching fire. There was stuff in there, and companies were dumping, refuse right into water supplies, unfiltered, air. You couldn't even see across some city. I mean, so... The pollution, the environment, the waste, it was just terrible. And today, it's better than terrible.
It is certainly better. And you know what? There's some research from the Conference Board's Marketing Communications Center that indicates that, consumers are recognizing the progress. They're seeing the progress that companies are making. They're recognizing the leadership that companies are exerting. And sure, there's a lot more to be done. But we're starting from a much different place, and frankly, companies' approach to this, because it's no longer, okay, we just comply with the Clean Air Act or Clean Water Act or something, they're actually embracing this as a business imperative. I think we're going to continue to make progress.
and I think, this is part and parcel to a multi-stakeholder world. When business leaders were focused solely on shareholders, you didn't quite, think about. But when you start thinking about which include multi-stakeholder world, finish my sentence, which includes customers, employees, owners, the environment, society, you start saying, holy cow, we've got obligations here. And I don't know of a business leader today who is not completely engaged and focused on that broad set.
Right. And it's a great prism to look at your business decisions, whether it's your business strategy, your capital allocation, M&A, to look at it through the prism you just said. Okay, if we're going to do a transaction, what does it mean for, obviously, the company's financial performance, but what does it mean for our customers, our employees, our communities? What does it mean for society at large, actually? What does it mean for the natural environment? Are we buying a company that actually has a bad environmental track record? Can we help make it better? Which could be a reason to do the deal. That broadening of the aperture, I think it's sometimes more challenging, but I think it leads to better long-term performance.
Black swan events used to be described as something that happened once in a lifetime and you couldn't predict them. And if you just look back over the past 3 years, it feels like we've had 3 black swan
I don't know.
events.
Is it a gaggle? Is it a flock? I'm not sure what swans are, but we've got whatever it might be called. We've got a bunch of them.
It's a big honking problem.
Yeah, it's a big honking problem.
But 3 of them. So the world has changed in this past couple of years.
Yeah.
With certainly the pandemic, the social justice issues, and now a war in Eastern Europe. Describe now the strains on a focus on sustainability while all of this other stuff is happening.
Sure. A few thoughts. The first is, we did a survey and put out a piece in spring of 2020 about what general counsel and chief investment relations officers thought the impact would be of the pandemic on sustainability. Half got it right, half got it wrong.
Yeah.
37% said it would shift the focus of sustainability. They were right. Another 10% said it would increase the focus on sustainability. They were right. The folks who said that it was going to decrease the emphasis, put it on hold, or have little or no effect, did not get it right. Because what we've seen is that there has been a shift during these times of stress, actually, to focus more on social issues. I think that's big. It's not just the environmental issues, it's social issues. So employee health and safety used to be concern of mining companies and folks like that. Now employee health and safety top concern of all companies. Racial equality after 2020, that is now, we know from our C-suite Outlook survey we did at the conference board, it's the number 2 social priority for CEOs in the US. Supply chain resilience and responsibility, so important.
Right.
So there's been this broadening of it. At the same time, people have had to make trade-offs. They're having to say, all right, we can't maybe move to energy independence right now because we have to shift sources of fossil fuels in Europe, for example, because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Right, supply issues. But, it's actually lighting a fire for increasing and the emphasis on renewable energy and alternative sources in the long run.
Yeah, this and people, I remember April 1970, I marched in the very first Earth Day. The whole point of sustainability was environmentalism in the pollution. But sustainability is much broader today.
It is, and who recognizes that maybe even more than sometimes companies are consumers. There's actually a little bit
employees.
And employees who are often one and the same, right? Exactly. And the number 2 issues for employees and consumers when it comes to sustainability, fair wages and fair labor conditions.
That doesn't sound like a sustainability.
But it is, because our entire system, our entire economic system, and frankly, our political system that relies on a stable and growing economy, are imperiled if we don't actually have a sense that people are paid fairly and working in fair labor conditions.
So your point is human capital is the backbone of this country now in a knowledge-based economy. And so therefore the sustainability of that human capital
is paramount for individual companies and for our entire economic system.
Wow. I'm not sure people really have thought about it that way, but you're right. It's kind of, it's sometimes.
No, it's a major shift. And I think companies are still grappling with this concept, and seeing how human capital is not just something that's isolated within the HR department, but understanding that, if you've got your business strategy, you've got to make sure that you've got the right people to execute it, right? And that also, if you're trying to become a more sustainable company, gosh, you've got to treat your employees well. Because if you don't, you can't go off and save the world if your employees are on food stamps.
Well, and if they're turning over continuously, then they're not really the core of your knowledge base.
Which means the companies need to have better analytics when it comes to human capital. They've got to not just look at it as an accounting cost, but view this all as an economic cost, an opportunity cost. What do you lose when you've got that kind of turnover?
Well, what's net zero?
That's a great question. I got to tell you, one of the biggest challenges in this whole area is just the alphabet soup, the different terms. What's the difference between one term and another? Okay, so net zero, I think, is a more intense version of carbon neutrality. So let me talk to you about what carbon neutrality is, which means that if a company is emitting carbon emissions, they can offset it through reductions in carbon emissions elsewhere. So you're producing pollution, carbon emissions on one hand. Well, you can plant trees in the rainforest. You can pay someone else to reduce their emissions elsewhere. Therefore, you get to carbon neutrality as a company.
And people say, well, why don't you just stop doing the original thing? But if you're producing food to feed people, you're producing carbon. So your point is, you have to produce. You have to have an economy that works, provides for our people.
Right.
But as you're doing that, find something else
to balance it. Right. And so that's carbon neutrality. Net zero is the notion that you get to the same place, but before you get into offsets, you do everything you can to reduce your own emissions.
And ultimately get to zero carbon. Yeah. Why this focus on carbon? I mean, why not everything else?
It is because of the connection between carbon emissions and climate change.
Yeah.
But I got to tell you that, this is looking at what consumers say. There is, of course, the intense focus on climate, but there are other environmental issues that consumers are focused on, and this is important for companies to keep in mind. Consumers care about things like the conservation of natural resources, which is related to climate, but they can care about that. They care about water. They care about plastics. They care about all the things going back to the 1970s, about litter on the highways, clean air, clean water. Climate is just part of a constellation of environmental issues, often interconnected, right? And I think that's important for people to keep in mind.
So, and, if you're reducing your carbon, you're also, in order to do that, you're reducing every other kind of emission, every other air and water emission.
Right.
You're reducing waste because all of those things produce carbon. So it becomes the molecule, the least common denominator of all.
Yeah, and you think about the connection between, for example, biodiversity and carbon emissions and climate change. So reduction in biodiversity contributes to climate change, and climate change also contributes to loss of biodiversity. So there's, a clear connection between these different elements.
Okay, but now we're out of gas. There's a diesel shortage. You can't get, the Russian exports into Western Europe. We don't have the LNG ports to, swap it out. We're kind of in a world of hurt. And now I'm hearing that, everybody's going to fire back up their coal plants. So we're in a time of global stress.
Yes.
Do we just say, forget it? We'll get back to net zero 100 years from now? Or what do you do?
No, actually, I think now is the time for companies to have a clear transition plan for getting to net zero. So this is one of the issues that's happened is in many cases, and this is a bit of a governance issue, in many cases, companies went out there with these bold targets of they're going to reach net zero by X year, right? And it was often management making those commitments. Sometimes they make commitments without fully thinking it through or fully involving the board. What you ought to be doing now is to say, look, we are in a world of hurt. We may be relying more on fossil fuels right now, but what is our true transition plan to get there? And that transition plan is going to come with costs. It's going to come with disruption. You really have to think through how you're going to get there. And that's, the terminology these days is, how do you have a just transition? And I think companies need to be focusing on that.
We're talking with Paul Washington about sustainability in times of stress. We're going to take a short break and we'll be right back.
As war rages in Ukraine, the Conference Board is closely monitoring the situation and producing timely and relevant content on a daily basis that will help the business community navigate this global geopolitical unrest. What will the impact be on oil prices, food prices, our supply chain, and what about cybersecurity? How will this conflict impact the way your organization does business around the world? And how will you communicate this crisis to customers and employees? We're gathering the very latest content on our website. Just head to conference-board.org and find trusted insights to help you and your team lead with confidence.
Welcome back to CEO Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board, and I'm joined today by Paul Washington, the leader of the Center for Environmental, Social, and Governance at the Conference Board. So, Paul, we're talking about, the environmental,
right,
net zero before the break. Sometimes in the game of soccer, a game that I never played, but I watched my children play, I learned that sometimes you have to kick the ball backwards on the field, and in order to then reset and go forward. Are we kind of in that time now where we have to reset with all of this global stress?
I think we do in some ways. So, this gets into the issue, for example, of where, for example, nuclear power sits in the future of sustainable energy. It's a little bit of a third rail for folks to talk about, but I think people need to consider, at a minimum, what role nuclear could play in a carbon neutral world. So that's taking us back some ways, but I think that needs to be part of the consideration set. Not taking a position on it, but I think people need to focus on it. The other thing where we really need a reset, or maybe some sort of an acceleration in some ways, is that the folks who are over in Glasgow in this past autumn were many of the usual suspects. As I talked to a few people who attended
Glasgow.
So Glasgow was that was the climate change conference that the UN does each year, right? And so I've talked to people who were there, and it said it was the same people promising to do more, which was great, but there were so many people missing there. And we see this in the US. We see, for example, that when it comes to companies embracing, or addressing climate risk, it's about half the S&P 500 does so, but it's a small fraction of the S&P 500. I think what we need is a reset in approach, which is let's make sure that this endeavor to reduce carbon emissions is everybody's business, every company's business. Every company should be focusing on it. Every company, no matter what your industry, you can do something. And let's celebrate the incremental achievements that all these companies are making. Let's encourage them to do so. Because I think that if we're just focusing on, the marquee players out there, and they're the ones who are out there making these bold commitments, we're not going to get where we need to be.
So, Paul, what do you say to the folks who say, well, the United States is only 5% of the world's population, number one. Number two, we could eliminate all carbon emissions. But if China and India don't deal with it, it isn't going to matter. And we spin through the same air, 12 hours later, but it's the same stuff. Well, should we just give up on it? Or,
no,
we can't tell China and India what to do.
No, you can't, but you can do a few things, and companies can do a few things. You're right. So, China represents, I think, latest data are 28% of the world's carbon emissions. India is 7%. So that's 35% together compared to 15% for the US. So I think there are a few things you can do, not only through government agreements, but I actually think that companies have, US buys a lot from China. And what we're seeing is that companies have a fair amount of power in implementing sustainability as part of their procurement practices.
Up
So
through
do
the supply
governments
chain.
up through the supply chain.
And you can do it in a productive,
That's
constructive
okay,
way, right?
That's exactly right. The worst thing you can do, actually, if you're trying to do this, is just have a checklist and say, okay, company, tell us what you're doing to do A, B, and C. That doesn't work. What you really want to do is to have a higher level strategic discussion with your suppliers and say, look, we're going to require us to get to this goal. This goal is in both of our interests. What can we do together, actually? What do you need to do? Maybe what do we need to do to lower carbon emissions? I mean, that kind of dialogue, that B2B dialogue, is going to be so critical because you got 69% of all procurement executives right now saying they're considering sustainability. You don't want to make this a check the box exercise.
And if you're an NGO or a group or somebody trying to make change, the worst thing you could do is go attack. I mean, it's like a Monty Python show where, you're standing on top of the castle, you see the marauders coming over the hill, you fill the moat, you get the alligators in the moat, you boil the oil, right? You defend the castle.
Yeah.
But, if the peace emissary comes over the hill, you invite them in, you have dinner, you talk about it, and you can get to change. So the whole interaction here needs also to be constructive.
Yeah. And so, and it's on both sides, right? So I think the nonprofits, the activist shareholders, they need to approach it to say, okay, here's what more you can do. This is what other companies are doing. It's a ton of constructive dialogue, and companies too. We are in fact seeing companies being more open to having that sort of constructive dialogue. What's happening, frankly, on the shareholder proposal front right now is that shareholders are actually less willing to compromise than in the past because the wind is at their back. And so, this may pass a little bit, but I think there's a lot that's incumbent upon shareholder activists and also mainstream investors not to support, and they aren't supporting the most radical proposals.
But you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar.
Exactly,
and so
right.
You've got to work quietly together on this thing. Paul, what's greenwashing?
So greenwashing is when a company makes itself appear or its products and services appear more environmentally friendly than they really are.
So that's like, I've got this little thing over here, so I'll talk about that when in fact I've got this big problem over there.
That's exactly right. And companies get in trouble. And we talked to the head of impact investing at T. Rowe Price about this a little while ago. He said that the surest sign that a company is greenwashing is if they feature in their 150-page CSR report, corporate social responsibility report, a lot of pictures and a lot of text about an initiative that maybe represents, a fraction of 1% of their revenue, and they're not addressing the rest of their business. He said, and I think he's right, that sort of thing undermines your credibility in everything you say.
Yeah, so it really is taking a small piece or a small activity, overstating it, and when they're bigger. So don't
do that.
Don't let the tail wag the dog.
Exactly, and find balance in your disclosures. Admit when you're not where you need to be. The other thing is just, this isn't just about trust and reputation. This is about litigation. I mean, there is a threat of consumer lawsuits, consumer law lawsuits, as well as securities law lawsuits if you don't do this right.
Yeah, and with disclosure law, that can be considered.
Yeah, materially misleading.
Exactly right. Yeah. Tesla was just, if you look at Tesla, it has been packaged as the brilliant ESG company moving us away from fossil fuels, yada. They were just dropped from the ESG index. What is that?
Well, I can't comment on the merits of it, but I can tell you what I understand happened and sort of the broader implications of it for companies. So they were dropped because it's, ESG has three components. So part of it was they didn't have an appropriate carbon plan. Now that wasn't about their business itself, which is producing electric cars. It's the way they produce it. In fact, they've been they recently settled with the EPA over their own operations pollution. So it was their own pollution, right?
So even if you have the
Yes.
greatest environmental product,
Right.
your actions
Exactly.
are important in how you get there.
Exactly. That, it's so important. And so they also got dinged for worker conditions, and we won't even start on governance. So, ESG. So, but what it says,
Governance by Twitter. You mean?
yeah, right. Exactly. So, but what that says is, I don't care if you're a windmill company.
Yeah.
That doesn't actually mean that you're necessarily a sustainable company, because you may not be running yourself in a way that's actually sustainable for the company.
So
right?
sustainability is not about, it's not just about
Correct.
the process,
Yes.
and it's not just about the product or the service.
It's both. It's absolutely. And one of the things that, companies need to keep in mind, this goes to rating agencies. There are about 600 different ESG, not talking credit rating agencies, ESG rating firms out there. And,
Sounds like a roll-up opportunity.
it's a roll-up opportunity. But there's this quote about every great cause begins as a movement, becomes a business, and degenerates into a racket. I'll let you decide whether we've tipped over from business to racket here. But, companies need to be very selective about what ESG rating firms they really care about, because many of them are a bit of a black box, and, they don't have a lot of sway. So our advice to companies is focus on a few where.
But there's a top couple, just name them. There's a UN.
Yeah,
framework.
well, that's the reporting frameworks, but you have Sustainalytics, you have MCSI, you have a few that a lot of folks deal with. But
But talk to your shareholders, find out which ones are important to
that's
them.
exactly right. And the ones that have credibility, the ones that you have visibility into their process that will listen to you, focus on those top 5 or 10 and ignore the other 590.
Okay, so on our march to net zero, we're trying to transform our energy use in this country, but the world globally, but in this country. So it's just, renewables are up to what, 18% or something like that. I think we have nuclear, which is another 10 to 15%, and coming down. But each one of these has their own issues.
Right.
The wind is episodic.
Yep.
It doesn't blow all the time, and when it blows, you kill raptors, and so there's
Right.
that. When you put solar panels, which are almost all made in China, by
Right.
the way, not made
Right.
here, and they're made with rare earth minerals, and when you're done with them, they are an environmental
Right.
nightmare, by
Right.
the way. So you have to think about the supply chain, but you cover the desert and you
Yeah.
kill everything underneath it. So and that's not sustainable. And then
Right.
you have battery technology, which is the same thing,
Yeah.
production, destruct. So we have to be thinking about all of this, and it's a journey.
Correct.
So there's some people who say, let's cut it off right now. No oil.
Yeah.
They're sort of like the Luddites but I think what you've said is, no. We need to be thinking about it more ratably.
Exactly.
And it's a journey.
It's a journey. It's a journey for every company. It's a journey for every country. And you need to be not having a singular focus on one issue, climate, or a singular focus on one set of metrics, carbon emissions. You need to look at this in the broader environmental and social context. That doesn't in any way reduce the concern about climate change. In fact, I think it makes it more possible to address climate change if you do this in a staged and thoughtful process that looks at all the pros and cons as you do this. Because otherwise, if you don't, there's going to be more of a backlash.
So half of the emissions from energy production, roughly, don't quote the exact numbers, but it's half of it's coal.
Yeah, I think it's 40% coal, 30 some is from oil, 20 some from gas.
And of the coal, there are like 10 plants that produce half of all the coal.
Mm.
So if we could just take 10 plants, convert them to natural gas, don't go all the way, don't try to boil the ocean. Just get those. We could get rid of almost 20% of emissions. So it's this kind of thing where you have to hit the low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, I agree. It's a combination of both that sort of targeted approach, and this is something where every company needs to be engaged, and frankly, consumer culture changes. Because I think for this to be durable, right?
Is it sustainable?
Indeed. You know, it's got to be embraced by everyone. We're doing a set of Chatham House Rule convenings, discussions with our members on what a sustainability culture means for a company. And one of the key concepts is a sense of ownership, that everyone owns their part of this journey. Everyone has a stake in making their company more sustainable. And I think that's what we need as a society.
So we need to look at sustainability from the beginning to the end of the entire chain. We need to have it be a productive journey.
Mhm.
We need to keep the end in mind, but
Yeah.
celebrate the success along the way.
Exactly right.
Paul Washington, thanks for being with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Steve.
And thanks to all of you for listening in to CEO Perspectives. Every week, I'll be joined by an expert in their field to talk about the issues of our time. We'll talk about sustainability. We'll talk about human capital, ESG writ large. We'll talk about globalization. We'll talk about economics, all the things you can think of. Please share CEO Perspectives with all of your friends, with your neighbors, with your relatives, with the cousins you haven't spoken to in years. I know they're going to want to listen. I'm Steve Odland.
And this series has been brought to you by the Conference Board.